Navy Day, this sort of stuff. So welcome. Welcome to the, if you haven't been here before, to our 8 Bells noontime lecture series. We've been going on this for a while, and this is one of our really successful events, so we're delighted to have our speaker here today. But as you noticed, for those of you who may have not come in the museum recently, we're in the process of changing things around. Exhibits are changing all the time, so come back often to see the changes. This room will be worked up here for the graduation time in June, as well as the entryway down there. All those exhibits, we've set a date early June to try to get those in place. So some exciting stuff coming on the American Revolution and the Naval Academy and the Civil War that was here, and the Perry family, colonial period, to be downstairs, and we'll be adding a lot of things here on the history of the Naval War College. The panel back there will have the Admiral Hewitt's medals, a great collection of his foreign and U.S. decorations. So that'll be a great, beautiful display that I'm looking forward to. But today we are especially honored to have Rodney Carlisle here, a retired professor from Rutgers University, a longtime friend of history of the Navy, has done worked on all sorts of studies in that area. So we're delighted to have him here, and I'm talking on his new book here, which is talking about the origins of the U.S. entry into World War I, the sinking of merchant vessels, and the whole broader issues of how countries get into war. A great topic for the Naval War College. So, Rodney, welcome.
Thank you, John. All right, with your permission, I'm going to actually read my talk, because although when I give a college lecture, I usually do it off the cuff, but I can get a lot more information over in about 20 minutes if I read it. So forgive me if it sounds like it's read, because it is. In recent years, we've heard a lot about casus belli. For both the Vietnam War and the Iraq War, Americans have asked such questions as these. Were the announced causes of American engagement in the war legitimate? Were the announced causes in fact the real causes, or did the administration have another agenda? Did the press and the public have access to accurate information, or was it intentionally or unintentionally distorted by the administration? Similar close analysis has been devoted to the casus belli of some other American wars. The literature on Fort Sumter and Lincoln's actions prior to the relief expedition sent to Major Robert Anderson is rich. Whole fat tomes have been devoted to December 7th, 1941, asking, in effect, what did Roosevelt know and when did he know it? However, in reviewing the literature surrounding American entry into World War I in April 1917, as a professor of history, preparing my lectures, I found a deep gap between the literature surrounding the broad issues of Woodrow Wilson's ideals and his interpretation of neutrality in the period 1914 to 1917 on the one hand, and the very specific actions that brought the United States into the war. In November 1916, Wilson won re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." In April 1917, just a few months later, he asked Congress to declare war on Germany. What happened? 10 U.S. ships were sunk, and some, but not all of these, I found, tipped the balance in favor of war for Wilson. Scholars who previously wrote about the events varied widely in reporting the number of American ships destroyed. They were all vague on the number of casualties. Some sources mentioned 3 specific ships. Others referred to a number of ships ranging from a handful to, in one case, 19 ships. It seemed a strange oversight that scholars who were extremely accurate in documenting Wilson's statements and in reviewing his cabinet deliberations would be so unconcerned with the specific facts. The variation and imprecision in the historical treatments prompted me to dig through the records of the period, including newspaper accounts, diaries, and memoirs, and official State Department documents to get the facts right. And of course, as I was talking to John Kennedy this morning, doing that is a lot easier today than it was years ago, because you can get the New York Times online, you can download a PDF, and you can get instant access to indexes. And in the old days, when I went to graduate school, it would take weeks of working with microfilm and struggling with it. But it's a lot easier to do today, and that for which I'm grateful. Germany announced unrestricted submarine warfare on February 1, 1917. By that, Germany meant that it had instructed her U-boats to sink without further warning all ships, no matter what their nation of registry, allied or neutral, found within certain zones of the North Atlantic, approaches to Britain and France, and within the Mediterranean. Open routes or safety zones were declared so that neutral ships could approach neutral Holland and neutral Greece. Between February 3rd, 1917, and April 7th, 1917, more than 200 neutral and allied ships were sunk by U-boats, mostly in the declared war zones. Exactly 9 of these ships were American ships, all of them merchant vessels. The total number of casualties that resulted from the sinking of the ship seems surprisingly low. Now on this slide, which I'm afraid you can't see if you're unless you're in the first row and you've got 20/20 vision, I've got 10 ships. And I actually prepared this slide when I was first starting off because I had discovered that there were 10 ships involved. But it turns out that one of them here, the Hilton, was sunk off Holland, and everybody thought it had been sunk by a torpedo from a U-boat, but in fact it was sunk by striking a mine that had been laid 2 nights earlier by the British. So really there are only 9 ships involved. And I've got more to say about the Hilton a little later in the talk. This table, if you could see it, shows that there were over 360 crew members on the 10 ships, about half of them American citizens. Altogether there were some 64 deaths, 24 of them American citizens. In 7 of the 10 cases there were no casualties at all, due to the fact that the U-boat captain provided time for the crews to evacuate in lifeboats, and also due to the fact that the crews were later picked up by other passing ships, or they made it safely to shore. Put in this light, one could say that the United States apparently entered World War I because a total of 24 American seamen were lost in the sinking of 3 American ships. The Vigilancia, the Hilton, and the Aztec. Now, Woodrow Wilson made his decision to convene Congress early. They weren't scheduled to meet, and prior to learning of the sinking of the Hilton. And he made that decision between March 18th and March 20th. So word of the sinking of the Aztec, which is down here on the list, these are in chronological order, the Aztec, the word of that sinking didn't arrive until April 2nd. So in fact, Wilson made his decision to call Congress on the basis of the casus belli of the sinking of the first 6 ships on this list, with the only casualties aboard the Vigilancia, which had only 5 Americans lost their lives. Now I'm going to run through some of the specific facts of the case. Let's see if we can just go to... this is the first one, headline from the New York Times. The Housatonic, and it had an international crew of 37, of whom 25 were Americans. And this ship was warned by the U-boat commander of U-53, who was Hans Rose. Rose then towed the lifeboats from their location off the Scilly Islands until he was within sight of a British patrol vessel, and then he fired a couple of shots so the patrol vessel would notice, and when they started approaching he submerged and cut the line so the lifeboats could be picked up. Very courteous help. Since the ship carried goods ordered by the British government, and since it was dealt with under cruiser rules, even many war hawks in the United States agreed that this was not an act of war. This occurred after the announcement of unrestricted submarine warfare, but nobody wanted to go to war over it. Hans Rose and U-53 were known to the American public as Rose had brought that U-boat right here into Newport, Rhode Island, briefly in the fall of 1916, a few months earlier. And I think I've got a shot here of he's coming, that's the U-53 coming into the Newport Harbor, being greeted by some American warships. The second ship was the Lyman Law, and a little more colorful. It was an old-fashioned trading schooner with a small crew of 10, carrying a cargo of wooden shucks for making lemon crates, and that's hardly a war cargo. It was accosted by a submarine in the Mediterranean off the coast of Sardinia, there was a considerable dispute in those days before GPS navigation as to whether the ship had been destroyed outside the safety zone towards neutral Greece. The crew was ordered off into boats, and then the submarine crew boarded and removed some chickens for their own stock, and then burned the schooner. At the time, the U.S. State Department was unsure whether or not the submarine was Austrian or German. Later revealed records indicated it was the German U-boat U-35 under the command of submarine ace von Arnold. And he, there he is, he was a very distinguished looking officer with a French name, but long distinguished record with the German Navy, and was the commander who sank more tonnage and more vessels than any other German U-boat commander in World War I. The third ship sunk was the Algonquin, sunk by gunfire and bombs off the Scilly Islands, and the crew survived 27 hours in open boats. The ship had just been transferred from Canadian registry to American registry, and definitely carried a contraband cargo for Britain. Now, in the case of all three ships, even the Warhawk press agreed that the sinkings, with no casualties and with proper warning, did not constitute the overt act that Wilson had said would be required for a declaration of war. Furthermore, the Algonquin wasn't even clearly a U.S. ship because of its recent transfer. The international law on that is complicated, but basically if a ship had just recently been transferred in order to, for convenience reasons, to be able to sail under a neutral flag, that didn't cut any ice, and the Germans would still regard it as British. Now, the three ships that were sunk together, Vigilancia, the city of Memphis, and the Illinois, they weren't all sunk at the same time, but over the weekend of March 17th and 18th. And despite some inaccuracies in the press, it turned out that almost all of the sailors survived. But at least one of the ships, the Vigilancia, was not warned. And this is just a postcard image of what, oh no, those are the U-boats in the Austrian port, Austro-Hungarian port of Cattaro, out of which von Arnold operated. That's von Arnold's deck gun. This is just a postcard picture of from a whole series of German postcards that were done to sort of illustrate what it was like when a ship went down. They're all available on the internet. They're now collector's items, you know. Now, these three ships that were sunk on the weekend, two were on a return voyage in ballast, and some news reports left a bit of mystery as to whether 4 or 5 Americans were killed on the Vigilancia. Later investigation showed that one of those killed was a Puerto Rican, and the New York Times in those days didn't consider Puerto Ricans quite American. It was fairly justified because they'd only been declared U.S. citizens by an act of Congress that had been passed about 2 weeks earlier. So people were still not familiar with the idea that Puerto Ricans would be, you know, full U.S. citizens. But if you count that young man, 5 had been killed, and they had been killed trying to get into a lifeboat, and the lifeboat got swamped. They weren't shot or anything like that. It was kind of an accident during evacuation. The impact of the news of the 3 ships at once was profound in the press. And here, the news, this is a summary that was in the New York Times of newspapers from all around the country. And it wasn't just public that got excited, but a cabinet met on the Tuesday after that, that was on March 20th, and they unanimously recommended for a declaration of war to Wilson. So what tipped the balance was those 3 ships on that weekend. Now, for the cabinet, Wilson didn't say what he was going to do, and he announced a day later, after thinking about it, that he would convene Congress early. So he didn't say what he was going to do, though, whether he was going to ask for a declaration of war or what. He just said that he was going to call for an early meeting of Congress. So everybody, and the meeting was scheduled for April 2nd. So it was a 2-week interlude there between the time he announced he was going to call for Congress and the date of the meeting. Now, the most dramatic and deadly of the sinkings was the Esso tanker Hilton one day after Wilson made his decision to call Congress together. That is on March 21st. There were 21 fatalities in that episode. The ship blew up in the middle of the night, and some of the crew escaped wearing only their skivvies and suffered frostbite and exposure in open boats. The ship was in the safety lane to Holland, or they thought. 7 of the people killed aboard were Americans. A mystery surrounded the event, though, even at the time. Germany denied then and later that the tanker had been sunk by a German submarine, although the crew and the captain said he saw a submarine. But a lot of people said they saw submarines when there really weren't any, because they, expected to see one. Or he might have been lying, but in any case, they said they saw a submarine. And the crew was picked up by a fishing trawler, and Congress had news of this event before they met. Further research has demonstrated that as I said earlier, that the ship struck a British mine late 2 nights earlier in the sinking. And at the end of my presentation, I'll go into that in a little more detail. It occupies a whole appendix in my book. A couple more were sunk. The Aztec, which was armed under the ship arm provision, and there were some casualties aboard that. The Missourian was another big freighter, and the Marguerite. Marguerite was another schooner, and I think I've got a nice picture of the. Oh, that's just a picture of Von Arnold sinking a freighter, and that's what these guys look like when they're out at sea. That's another ship going down. That's another painting of life aboard the U-boats on the deck. That's the schooner, and you can see how it was marked. Let's see if I can do this. Oh, I forget we don't have a projector. It's marked USA, and it's got a couple of American flags on it. So this was this painting was done right before it was destroyed, sometime in 1916 or 1917, because these markings had been developed as a way of proving that the ship was a neutral ship, and they weren't. It wasn't customary to have those in 1914 and 1915. So this was a painting can be pretty well dated 1916 or very early 1917. Actually, the word of the sinking of the Marguerite never reached the United States until after Congress had already voted. So the sinking of this particular ship didn't play any part in the decision process, even of Congress. And now these are just the facts of the case, and I had to read them off to make sure I got them all in. But they raised some very interesting questions, and maybe we can talk about these, and I'll raise them, and I'll give you some of my thoughts on it. Did Wilson believe that the loss of 5 American seamen drowned from a swamped lifeboat during the evacuation of a warned merchant ship steaming in an announced war zone constituted a legitimate casus belli? And I think yes. Wilson made his decision after the weekend, sometime after that weekend when the 3 ships were sunk. The loss of 5 lives aboard seemed to tip the balance, but there were a lot of ultimate causes behind his decision. It seems that this weekend action was what we might call the proximate cause, or the tipping point. However, an interesting question comes up that, as I said before, he made the decision to call Congress after the 3 ships had been sunk, and clearly sunk by German submarines. He didn't really even confide to his closest advisors that he was going to ask for a declaration of war until after the Hilton was sunk, the one that struck the British mine. Now, I'm not saying that's what convinced him, but the sequence is correct. How did the press and the public react to these events? Well, oddly enough, the public and the press largely shared Wilson's views that the first three losses didn't constitute the overt act. That is, the first three that I mentioned, the Housatonic, the Lyman Law, and the Algonquin. And the public mood seemed to shift after the sinking of the Vigilancia. So the public was very impressed with the fact that Americans had been killed. But that, as I say, that seemed to be for the public the tipping point as well. What was the underlying thought process? Here's another question. What was the underlying thought process of the President and Congress that required that these few violations of American neutrality be seen as so grave as to justify a declaration of war? That's really a central issue. The underlying thought ran something like this. Germany had announced a policy, but it wasn't until those three were sunk, the Vigilancia, the city of Memphis, and the Illinois, that the public and Wilson finally became convinced that the policy really would be carried out ruthlessly. And he had explicitly stated that the first three didn't constitute overt acts, and that he said would be required to establish a state of war. The first two were warned. The third was not clearly a U.S. flagged ship. America had protested earlier violations of neutrality with notes, without any, and very similar, actually, even before this point. Several American ships had been sunk either accidentally or after being warned. A couple had been warned and evacuated, even before the announcement by the Germans back in 1916. So, however, Wilson and his advisors and the American public saw the sinking of these three ships, flying the U.S. flag, sinking of them without a warning, as a clear act of war, whether or not there were any casualties. So I have come to conclude it was the flag, not the sailors, that was being defended. You see, it didn't matter. Those other two, there weren't any losses on the city of Memphis and the Illinois. Everybody survived on those. In fact, there was one minor injury on the Illinois. So, yet together they constitute an act of war because these ships hadn't been warned, and it was a violation of American neutrality to fire on a U.S. flagged ship, whether or not anybody was killed. Now, other people have explained the causes of American entry into World War I in terms of a lot of other circumstances. 200 Americans, something over 200 Americans have been killed aboard neutral ships. Other ships, Allied ships. 120 of them had been killed aboard the Lusitania in 1915. But that was by this time, that was a long time ago. People often remember the Lusitania as the cause of American entry into World War I, but that was a dead issue by this time, except it was remembered in Congress, but it wasn't a tipping point. It wasn't a casus belli. The Zimmermann Note has been discussed a great deal. In fact, Barbara Tuchman wrote a book about the Zimmermann telegram. That event had come and gone by this time. People got irritated at the Zimmermann Note, and it did change some public opinion, but it wasn't an act of war, and Wilson didn't treat it as an act of war. He had plenty of time to treat it as an act of war, but he didn't. It got mentioned in the cabinet, and it got mentioned in Congress, but it wasn't part of the immediate cause for Wilson. I've stopped reading. I'm just ad-libbing this part, as you can tell. When Wilson gave his speech requesting a declaration of war as the world's largest neutral and the world's largest democracy, the United States had a right and an obligation to speak for the people of the world, he said. So he was trying to cast his speech in more idealistic terms. But those idealistic terms hadn't been what had shifted, the decision. And it's interesting, 50 members of Congress voted against a declaration of war. I also found it interesting that, and I went through the debates very closely, both the pro and the con, everybody who spoke for or against the declaration of war. And the people who opposed it, not one of them got up and said, wait, are we going to war for 6 Americans or 15 or 21, depending on how you count them? None of them raised that. They raised other issues, that the United States hadn't been properly neutral, that Germany had every right to run a blockade to try to prevent goods coming into them. This is the position of the anti-war people. Some said we're going to war for the dollar. A little more left-leaning politicians took that stand. But not one of them said, wait, 6 people have been killed and we're going to go to war for 6 Americans? So it wasn't the number of deaths, which is what I first thought when I first started this, that it was somehow a few Americans had been killed that it started or served as a casus belli. But it was instead this sinking of U.S. flagged ships. Now, another question that kind of bothered me, and I raised this at a conference a couple of years ago when I started this project: why have historians been so vague and inaccurate in the loss of these merchant ships? And I think there's a variety of reasons for the fact that the historians just never focused on it. For one thing, the larger issue of neutrality and Wilson's thought process and how we maintained our neutrality have interested diplomatic historians. And this issue is really kind of mundane for people who operate on that high plane of ideas and ideals. The actual issue of what happened and when it happened didn't appeal to intellectual historians. But that's not the whole reason, I don't think. Another reason is that people have looked at his speech, and he didn't specifically refer to these ships. He didn't say, we're going to war because of these ships, in his speech. In fact, he raised a bill of particulars that was very extensive and that raised questions about Germany not respecting the rights of humanity, and about it being an autocratic government, and that the autocratic governments were threatening the democratic governments. That's where the motto, a war to make the world safe for democracy, came out of that concept in his speech. And when the post-war revisionists set out to criticize Wilson, they didn't focus on this final decision, but they focused on the earlier policies that had, in their mind, had pushed Germany to declare unrestricted submarine warfare. In other words, what was it that had been unneutral about American neutrality that made the Germans decide ultimately that they had to sink American ships? That was the issue that interested the revisionist historians who were critical of Wilson. None of them took the tack of, wait a minute, we only went to war for 6 people being killed. And then, as I mentioned at the very beginning, until recently, it was hard to do this kind of research. It took, even with a computer and access to the New York Times through ProQuest, it took a long time to collect all this information, sort out which news story is correct, which one isn't, and also to get the German records, which I did, to confirm everything. So in 1985, it would have been practically impossible for me to write this book. In the year 2005, it wasn't hard. Now let me just give you a little more detail on the Hilton. Let's see what I've got here. That's just another ship. These are just some more of these nice postcard shots of ships going down. That's one of the prettiest ones, if you can think of it. But you see it's the U.S. Oh, no, I'm not quite sure what kind of a flag that is. Okay, now this is a map of the minefield. And of course you can't make much out of it. But the Hilton, this was the sea lane that was safe, the neutral sea lane that allowed you to come in and then go up along the coast to get into the Dutch ports. The sea lane, and these were mines out in here. These are all different minefields. The minefield 21 was the one laid by the British. This is a German map, and they picked up on where the minefield was, and they discovered it. And this was laid on March 19th, 1917. Now, what was the ship doing outside of the neutral zone? Well, it turns out that this original dotted line is where the safety lane was, and it was only changed after these other mines were laid. And this is the Terschelling Bank, and the ship. Now over here is the Terschelling light ship, which you could see. They called it Piccadilly Circus, the British, because you could see it, the lights of it, from 25 miles out. And over here on Terschelling Island, there's a lighthouse, the Branderis Light. Well, the captain of the ship said he was 25 miles north east of the Terschelling Light. Now, which light? If he was 25 miles northeast of that one, that would put him up here, where there were no mines. If he was 25 miles northeast of the Terschelling Light on the lighthouse, it would put him right on this minefield that had been laid a couple of nights before. And I've got another. There, this is my own sketch to make it a little simpler. And there's the Branderis Light down on Terschelling Island, and the light ship is over here on the edge, and that's 25. Oh, he said north by east, didn't say northeast. So north by east is a nautical direction, you know. So that's 25 miles, 25 nautical miles north by east from the light ship, but 25 miles north by east from the Branderis Light is up in here, and the minefield was, went and got from Portsmouth in England. I didn't go there, actually. The guy at Portsmouth was very nice to send me all this stuff. Another thing that you can do by internet you couldn't do years ago. He sent me the records of the minefield ships, and there were three of them, Princess Margaret, the Angora, and the Wahine, and they laid in a zigzag pattern, and they didn't say how much they zigged and how much they zagged. So I just made up this little thing to show that they were zigzagging. Of course, they might have zigzagged a couple of miles, which would take them right out to where this exactly 25 miles north by east of the light would be. So it's not absolutely certain it was a British mine, but no German subs were there. Now I thought, well, maybe it was the British subs that he saw. And so I got the records, another researcher for me, a very nice guy, just volunteered his time. I said, I'll pay you to do this. He said, oh no, he said, I'm in the British Museum anyhow, I'll do it for you. And that's the way the Brits are, you know. And so he sent me, he took his little camera and he took pictures of the documents. And the submarine, the British submarine E-43, on noon on the 21st was way up there. And I got the records and plotted it on the chart, and that's about to scale of how far off they were. So I don't think the captain of the Hilton saw the E-43. And there's no reason to believe that the E-43's logbooks, which I looked at, were falsified. There was no indication there was anything fake about it, you know. So anybody comes up with a conspiracy theory that the British actually sunk the Hilton to tip the balance for the Americans with a torpedo would be talking through their hat, I think. I think it's much more likely that it was an accidental hit on one of the mines, or perhaps two of the mines laid by the Angora. Let's see, I just did all that off the cuff. And, all right. What do we have here? Oh, this is there's a little map you can get off the web that shows the depths out here. And actually, some European dive enthusiasts have located all the shipwrecks out there. And there's about 3 or 4 just where the Hilton is. So I'd like to have some dive enthusiasts go down and see if they can find the Hilton. Of course, it's not liable to be much left. You know, a tanker, when it goes, comes apart pretty badly, and it was on fire. So it might be pretty hard to tell whether it was struck a mine or was hit by a torpedo, or even if this particular pile of wreckage is the Hilton, unless you can actually find the name painted on it or something like that. Nevertheless, it would be nice to know. So I've suggested this to a number of dive enthusiasts that they might like to get out there and track it down. So to sum it up, I don't think Wilson asked for a declaration of war because of a mistake here about the Hilton. Because I know that the Cabinet and Congress were making their decisions based on a whole bunch of other stuff. And the Cabinet, particularly, even including the peaceniks, the doves in the Cabinet, oddly enough, the Secretary of War and the Secretary of the Navy were both peace advocates, which is the way Wilson appointed people. They came around to supporting a declaration of war, along with 1 or 2 other members of the Cabinet who had been resisting it all along. After the sinking, before the Hilton, you know, when the sinking of the Vigilancia occurred. So if the Hilton's important, it may have helped tip the balance for Wilson, and it certainly helped tip the balance in Congress. So I'm going to end with a commercial, and that's the book that covers it. All right, that's my presentation. I'm open for questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, what's the name of that German submarine commander that came into Narragansett Bay?
Hans Rose.
Hans, H-A-N-S?
Rose, R-O-S-E. And he had, there's quite a nice story about that. That was in the press, you know, and it was in the New York Times, too. You can look it up in the New York Times Index. But you can look it up in the local papers, which I think John Kennedy's just got through doing. And you got a display on him in there?
Are we talking about Nick Schaus?
No.
See, we've got the tale in Jamestown, the old timers, that by God, just before the war, up comes a German submarine in front of Nick Schaus's house over there, and they visited.
Oh yeah, well
man Schaus.
They could have. Yeah. In fact, the commandant of the naval station and another officer went aboard the U-53. It pulled in. They had a little tour, and in fact, some journalists went aboard, and they took the crew all came up on deck, so there'd be room to walk around down below. They took the officers down and showed them around, said, you know, this is how we launch a torpedo and everything. And the crew weren't very talkative. They, probably because they didn't speak English, but the officers all spoke English. So they had, and then journalists came aboard, and Hans Rose gave him a letter and said, could you mail this for me? And it was to the ambassador, the German ambassador in Washington. You know, he said he just wanted to have a letter mailed, you know, and they said, sure, you know, I'd be happy to do that. Yeah. And they didn't even look at it, you know, they didn't give it to the Naval Investigating Service or ONI, you know, they just mailed the letter. And so, you know, those were different times than we're living in today, to say the least. But it's quite a story about Hans Rose coming in. And in fact, there was a full-page spread. What they, a couple of naval, I don't mean to go on and make a whole lecture out of your question, but you know, you just opened a whole can of worms that I got in there. The interesting thing is that some naval strategists said if he can come into the harbor of Newport, he can come into New York Harbor when we go to war. And this indicates that we're very vulnerable. And so there was quite a bit of thinking about the lack of American defenses. And in fact, after Rose left, they packed up and they left. And they were in for less than 48 hours. They had 48 hours to come in and get supplies or repair damages. A warship was allowed into a port to do that. He said, well, we don't have any damage and we don't have any, we got plenty of supplies. We're just in for a visit. And so they left. But then off of Long Island, he sunk 9 ships. Not in territorial waters, but like 14 miles off of Long Island. And somewhere between Long Island and Nantucket, down there. And 2 Dutch, I have the records in the book, I forget exactly, 2 Dutch and 5 or 6 British ships. And nobody was killed, again, they were all evacuated. And in fact, American destroyers were watching the operation. They couldn't interfere. And so they helped pick up the survivors, and meanwhile he's picking off all this merchant ships, warning them. And
well, I might add that I understand that the concern in little old Jamestown was that the guy who was visiting was the superintendent of schools. So you could just.
Oh, and he was he German? German American?
Schaus is the name.
Yeah.
That's the family. They're still there. Still the same house. So if you don't, it ain't Irish, okay? That.
The Schaus house.
The Schaus house. There you go. And
that's probably that makes sense too. Yeah.
But
Okay.
that is funny. The school.
And then he sank the first ship. Talk about odd coincidences. Another one. I make a little point of this in the book. But in maritime lore, there's always these strange coincidences that you think, that Neptune is up to something. But the Housatonic was the first U.S. ship sunk by Germans after the declaration of unrestricted submarine warfare. The Housatonic. But the first warship ever sunk by a submarine was the Housatonic in the Civil War. Same name, sunk by the Hunley in Charleston Harbor. So, it's one of those things. But.
Thank you.
After World War I, the question came up between the British and the French of whether the British should leave a force in France to make sure that Britain was going to be involved should the Germans come back.
Oh, yeah, I see. Like a tripwire force,
And,
yeah.
Marshal Foch was asked, well, how large a force does this need to be? And Foch said, a single British soldier, and if the Boche come, I will ensure that he is killed. Implying that the threshold in terms of lives was very low, and it was really a matter of honor, that the British honor would be violated, and that would probably end.
Right.
And
The fact that he would be a British soldier would, of course it would be, as you say, that supports the idea that it was the deaths, the 5 or 6 deaths, rather than the flag. Except...
well, no, it was the flag. In this case, the killing of one British soldier was enough to dishonor the flag.
Yeah, okay, there you go, yeah.
And violation of sovereignty.
Yeah, see, I didn't go into it here, but I spent a couple of chapters in the book about the ships that were sunk by the Germans before February 1, 1917. And there are 8. You go through them all, and actually one wasn't sunk, it was actually seized and taken back to Germany, and was converted into the Sea Adler, which was a famous raider. The whole books have been written about the Sea Adler, but that was originally an American ship. It had been built in Scotland, but it was American flagged. But anyway, I looked into all those 8 ships, and there were protest notes about them. One was actually sunk by a surface vessel, each one by a German cruiser, converted cruiser that it had been in China, in the German possessions in China. And the cruiser, I mean, it was a passenger ship converted to a cruiser, and then it was operating around the world, sank a bunch of ships, and they would always take the passengers and crew and take them aboard and give them accommodations on this passenger ship. So, and the captain and his wife were aboard the schooner, the Fry, which was sunk off of Brazil, and they gave them the bridal suite on the cruiser. And finally, months later, just before the United States went into war, the ship shows up in the oh no, it was actually not that late. It showed up in Norfolk and was impounded, the German cruiser, and of course all the prisoners or captives were released, and the Germans pledged not to leave the base. They said they gave their parole that they wouldn't go. And funny story, they set up they had nothing to do, these sailors, for like 18 months. So they got a bunch of scrap lumber and they built a little imitation German village with flower pots and geraniums in it, and a little post office, and so you could go down and mail a postcard, from this German village, and it cost a dime to get in, and the stories are phenomenal. But in any case, there were these 8 ships that one way or another had been sunk, and the United States did not regard those as acts of war because they had followed cruiser rules. They carefully warned everyone, and the ships were indeed determined to have been carrying contraband cargo, and the United States protested, and the Germans said, well, if you don't like it, bring it to our prize court, and the case to our prize court, and we'll work out compensation properly. And State Department got all ticked off about that procedure, and they exchanged notes, But it was not an affront to the flag, because it wasn't an act of war sinking a ship without warning. I'm sorry to give you these long answers, but I have a lot to say. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, go ahead.
Can you see any relation, especially because you're bringing this new information to light, which is interesting, like you said, it wouldn't have been possible 25 years ago, but now it is. How does that, in your opinion, factor into the newer wars that we've gotten ourselves into, and our decision-making process, and how we've been educating ourselves based upon the history that we know?
Well, that's very much on my mind. I'm not sure we've done very much about educating ourselves or our students about any of this. However, at the decision-making level, I think something very similar is going on. If you look at the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was used and of course it's been closely researched, the apparent casus belli was the firing on a U.S. naval ship. The attack on the World Trade Center, which justified the attack on Afghanistan, was an attack on American sovereign territory. Of course, the much more controversial one is the engagement in Iraq, and there was no casus belli traditionally in that case, and of course that's one of the reasons it was so controversial, and why George Bush got himself in such a pickle with the American public. I mean, it seems to me that, well, my opinion is my opinion. It seemed to me a pretty justified war on other grounds, but not by the rules of war, So, but it's pretty clear. Actually, I'm giving a paper tomorrow down at a mystic at a conference of the North American Society of Oceanic History on how the United States came to the verge of war in the late 19th century over affronts to the flag, insults to the flag. And in fact, I was just wandering around the museum here before you all arrived, and right around the corner here there's a little mention of the attack, the capture by Spain of a U.S. ship that had a bunch of filibusterers aboard trying to assist Cuba in 1873. And that's one of the ones I mentioned tomorrow. There was a war scare with Spain in 1873. And of course we got into war. There were several other war scares in the 19th century over American merchant ships who, for one reason or another, the flag was insulted or affronted, or an outrage had been committed. Those are the words that the press used at the time. Insults, outrages, and affronts. Like the flag had a personality, you know. And there's been psychological studies done of the cult of the flag and so on. But in any case, we didn't go to war until the battleship Maine, 1898, of course. I don't know, that's kind of a rambling answer to your question. But I think a study of the history of how we got into war and why we got into war and whether or not it was justified is a very important topic. And, you know, these days with ship piracy, it may come up again, let's put it that way.
Well, this is kind of rambling itself, I guess, but aren't we getting now into what we call preemptive wars, particularly when you mentioned Iraq, or just trying to justify that, which is a new element.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We haven't done preemptive wars before, or at least we tried. If they were preemptive, we'd put them in the guise of an affront to American sovereignty in some way. But actually, you're quite right. Yes, go ahead.
There's a recent book by James Bowman entitled Honor, a History, that deals in those very issues.
Oh, really? I'll have to take a look at it.
It's a very nice book.
Yeah, I've seen that title. I haven't. I better get a hold of it.
Who wrote it?
James Bowman.
That's funny. I've got I know another Bowman who wrote a very nice review of this book for Amazon. Well, you mean, go ahead.
How are the issues of sovereignty different from that time period to today, where nationalities of crews, ship ownership, and operators are seem to be very clouded? It could be one country owner, one country operated crew from a third country carrying cargo from somewhere else, and the cargo could change hands in the matter of transit. Is it as clear cut as it used to be, or?
I've written a whole book about that subject too. I wrote another book called Sovereignty for Sale, published by the Naval Institute Press, and it's about the origin and evolution of flags of convenience, particularly Liberia and Panama. And what you're raising is partly a flag of convenience issue. The reason that the United States in a big way began to endorse and use flags of convenience, particularly that of Panama, in 1939, 1940, 1941, was precisely to avoid a casus belli. In fact, at the end of this book, I have a little summary of that impact. Because I realized that the United States had gotten into war because its U.S. ships were sunk, the neutrality legislation that was passed in September 1939, well actually it was November 1939, after Germany invaded Poland, the neutrality legislation in the United States was updated in 1939 to what they called the Cash and Carry Act. Under the Cash and Carry Act, if any ally wanted, or any other country, they didn't specify which side, any country wanted to take anything on a list of contraband, like weapons and other, trucks, things that could be used in war. They had to pay cash. They couldn't borrow money in the United States to do it, because that was one of the reasons it was perceived that America got deeply in the position of being a creditor to the Allies in World War I, and they had to carry it. It couldn't be carried on U.S. vessels. U.S. flag ships were prohibited from taking contraband of war. However, Esso, now Exxon, didn't like that, because they wanted to continue to sell petroleum, which was on the list of contraband, to the British and French. They happened to have a few ships already registered in Panama. There's a whole story behind that, which I won't take a whole digression to get into. But anyway, they had a handful of ships in Panama. So they started sending their Panamanian ships over. American-owned, American cargoes, mixed crews. In fact, some of them had German crews. They got the German crews off, and they put British crews on, Canadians on real fast, and started using these Panamanian tankers. So then a lot of other companies said, well, if you can do it, we can do it. So a lot of ships applied for transfer to Panama in 1939, 1940, and Roosevelt, who was very pro-Allied, made sure the Maritime Commission didn't put any obstacles in the way of these transfers. So the flags of convenience were used as a way of getting cargoes to England and France without putting the flag at risk. And then during the war, a lot of ships were confiscated from all over the world, once we got into the war. And the War Shipping Administration was running them, but they found out if they registered them in the United States, they'd have to go by U.S. labor laws and manning rules and percentage of American crew. And they didn't have enough merchant marines to man all these ships that they confiscated from everywhere in the world, So they registered them in Panama, and they called the ships under U.S. effective control, because they would have contracts with the ship charter arrangements where they could control. So you got me on to another whole lecture. I'm sorry. I could go on, but I'm going to stop right there. But anyway, that was the origin of American flags of convenience. John, you're going to try to cut me off?
Yeah, well, if there are no more questions, but give another chance.
One or two more, because we're coming up at the end of the hour.
Some people want to get to other things. But
and to lunch.
Lunch. Okay. Could have brought their lunch too.
This is supposed to be a brown bag lunch, isn't it? Okay, thank you very much.